So we finally made it to 10k subs, which is massive, and all in under a year. I have you guys to thank, you're awesome. With that said, I won't waste any more time. Let's jump into the Q&A. Bitophalis asks a question about being hanged, drawn and quartered. She asks, how is it possible to stay alive for this though? Wouldn't you bleed out or pass out? Now, for those who don't know, being hanged, drawn and quartered means that you're strangled by hanging just until you're nearly dead. Then they take you down, they cut you open, pull out your guts, sometimes they snip off your bits too, and then they chop you into lots of little bits. Well, the short answer to that question is that you didn't stay alive for it. It's a form of execution, so the point is to leave you dead. The real question though is, when did you actually die? And for most people, it would be during the drawing phase of the process, and this would have been, like the question implies, from either shock or blood loss. The executioners who did this kind of work were very, very skilled and would have known exactly what bits to cut and what bits to leave alone so that you could draw the process out for as long as possible, at least several minutes. But obviously, once you open someone up and start pulling out their entrails, you're already fighting a losing battle against blood loss and so on. So yes, you would have stayed alive for the most gruesome parts of the experience, at least for a couple of minutes. It's worth remembering though that those are probably some of the longest minutes you could ever imagine enduring, and you would probably be conscious. Adrenaline is a hell of a drug. So yes, you would stay alive long enough to have a very, very bad time. Miss Scala asks, isn't it a shame they left this part out of Braveheart? And the bit that's left out is of course the fact that William Wallace dies by being hanged, drawn and quartered. Well, the answer to that question depends on how much you want to see the details. It is kind of implied that he's having a pretty rough time, but yeah, we don't see any of the really bad details, which is a weird choice because it does make him a martyr historically, but I guess they wanted to keep that PG rating. Okay, Bob Webb asks, how were these murderers, I think he means executioners, trained to be so efficient? Were they trained on prisoners? And honestly, the answer to this question depends on when and where in history we're talking about. The shortest answer is that in Europe at least, where we have the best records, it was usually a family business. So you would start when you were young and learn through practice and hand-me-down talks from the elders in the family. This actually leads us nicely onto another question by Francis Corriman, who asks, how did an 18-year-old get that job? And here he's referring to a man named Charles-Henri Sanson, who was charged with the execution of Damiens in 1757. Now, when Sanson was just 18 years old, he had to do this execution. So the question is, how did he get the job? Especially since Damiens' execution was easily one of the worst deaths in history, and you can see the details about it on my video on the guillotine. But something I did leave out of that video was that Sanson, who was just 18, wasn't actually working alone. It was his uncle, Charles Gabriel Sanson, who led that execution. That doesn't mean that the 18-year-old Sanson was just watching though. He would have had to get his hands dirty throughout the entire process, but basically he was working under his uncle, and he got the job because, as we said above, being an executioner was a family business. During this time in France, there was also quite a lot of superstition and stigma around being an executioner. So even though it was seen as a kind of necessary service that they provided, individual people didn't want to really associate with them. In fact, there was so much discomfort around them that when they went to the market, for instance, the executioner would carry around a big spoon with them that they would use to pick up whatever goods they wanted. They didn't want them touching their stuff. And very often, the executioners wouldn't pay because the vendor didn't want to take their money because it was kind of dirty, cursed, superstitious, not good, just let him have his spoonful of whatever it is he wants. But all of this basically meant that if you were born into a family of executioners, you were already kind of a social outcast and a bit of a leper, and so you were never going to be able to be or do anything else than the family trade, which was, of course, very nasty business. Okay, next question. Los Hobos asks, how can we support you further and get more content? And That's a very nice question to ask, and as of this week, I have officially opened Patreon, which means you can support the channel by becoming a member over there. I'm not sure what exactly the benefits will be yet for those who sign up, and I'm hoping that since we're still a really small community, I can actually get everyone onto a Zoom call or something like that, and we can take a vote and have a chat about what you guys want to see in return, whether that's exclusive content, early access to videos, more live events, more poetry and literature stuff, or a behind the scenes look. Just you guys let me know and I'll make sure it's worth it for those who sign up. There's a link in the description below. Okay, Andrew Lupnow has a question about the hooks. He asks, was this gaunching, or did that term refer specifically to dropping the victim onto a bed of spikes made of metal and or sharpened wood? So, for those who don't know, the hooks was a form of punishment used in Algeria between around the 16th to the 19th century, and was an execution in which you basically just shoved someone off of a city wall so that they could then fall down and be snagged on a series of meat hooks that ran along the wall. The idea is that the hooks would catch you and impale you so that you'd just be left dangling and bleeding for a couple of days before you eventually died. It was really, really brutal, and we only have about 3 or 4 sources of its use, usually from Europeans who were visiting the city of Algiers or who were captive slaves under the Barbary pirates. Now, I hesitate to call the hooks a form of gaunching because in reality, the distinction between the hooks and gaunching is actually more or less arbitrary. But with the hooks, you're left to dangle while impaled on the side of the wall. With gaunching, you're chucked directly onto a bed of sharpened stakes. Either way, you die of impalement, which is either going to be blood loss, or if you're unlucky and a major blood vessel or organ isn't struck, then you basically just die of exposure. Neither would be very fun at all. I guess you could call the hooks a form of gaunching. I don't actually think there is a name for the hooks. I've seen them called the Algerian hooks. I've seen them called a form of impalement. I guess they're a form of gaunching too. It's a pretty obscure punishment. I've not seen much else on it, which is why I made that video, because when I came across it, I was like, damn, that's bad. Okay, next up, Stephen has a question about treason. Now, in medieval England, the punishment for high treason is that fate of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. So Stephen asks, is there a low treason, right? High treason, is there a low treason? And yes, there is. So high treason is basically anything that would constitute violence or rebellion against the king. So if you're found guilty of trying to kill the king or his direct heirs, if you try and wage war against the king, or you counterfeit his seal or money, which is basically impersonating the king, then you would be guilty of high treason. And that means you get put to death in very nasty ways, like we've discussed. Low treason, however, is for lesser crimes against the crown. Now I say lesser, but these crimes were still taken extremely seriously and could very easily result in execution, although probably a lot less savage, like being hanged, drawn, and quartered. Low treason was stuff like helping a prisoner escape, not coming to a king's aid during a battle, or conspiring maybe to murder one of the minor nobles in the king's administration. Like so much medieval law, though, the interpretation of a crime was pretty flexible, and so it was really up to the king and the other decision makers at the time to determine what was and what was not high treason on a case-by-case basis. As a general rule of thumb, though, if you don't want to die horribly, just stay on the king's good side. Do not levy war against the king. Okay, William Condizio asks, will I be doing more long-form stuff like podcasts and compilations? Yes, I will start doing compilations again soon. Podcasts, not sure. That might be something for the Patreon community members. Who knows? No promises. Okay. Mr. Shanghai Shuffle asks, weren't the 8 regicides of Charles I hanged, drawn, and quartered? For those who don't know, regicide is the murder of the king. So 8 regicides, the 8 people who murdered the king, this one being Charles I. Basically, yes and no. In 1649, Parliament actually condemned King Charles to death after a pretty brutal civil war. I won't go into too much detail, as I want to do a longer video on this topic later, but basically, during this sentencing, there were 8 men that signed the king's death warrant. And of those 8, 5 of them were killed. The most significant of these being, of course, John Bradshaw, who was basically the judge of Charles I's trial. However, 3 of those 8 survived. Obviously, they're dead now, but they didn't get hanged, drawn and quartered, and those were Oliver Cromwell, Henry Ireton, and John Lambert. Okay, next up we have one from Dragan Andre, who has a question about the siege of Sui Yang, which went down in 8th century China. And during this siege, up to 50,000 civilians were eaten by the defending army in what is probably, don't quote me on this, but probably the largest act of cannibalism in recorded history. So, Dragan asks, why didn't the civilian population leave the city? Which is a good question. If you're going to be eaten, surely you'd just leave. But unfortunately, they couldn't leave. The interesting bit, though, is the reason they couldn't leave isn't because the defenders didn't let them. It's actually the opposite. See, the way a siege works is that the attacking forces basically just camp outside the city walls and wait for the people inside to surrender or become too weak to properly defend themselves. This is because defenders will only have access to a certain amount of food that they happen to have inside the walls. Because they're under siege, no more food can enter the city. The attackers, however, can in theory, not always, but in theory, replenish their food stores whenever they need to through their supply lines, which remain open. So, if you're laying siege to a city, the best possible thing that can happen is that the besieged people inside run out of food, and that they run out of food quickly. So for this reason, you want to keep the civilian population inside the city's wall while they're under siege. And that way, they eat through the food even faster and surrender in the shortest time possible. For instance, at the siege of Alesia, the defending Gallic forces tried to expel their civilian population so that they could hold the town for as long as possible with the limited food that they had. But the Romans refused these civilians the right to pass their lines. The Romans wanted them inside the city walls, eating through that food. So, when the civilians turned back away from the Romans and towards the gates of Alesia and asked to be let back in, the Gauls, who were their fellow countrymen by the way, said no, stay outside, which meant that the entire population of Alesia was just left in between the Roman defences and the city walls, and they were basically just left there to starve to death, which they did. At the siege of Sui Yang, the attacking forces were betting that the defenders would run out of food pretty quickly if they had 50,000 civilians to feed, but obviously this backfired pretty horrendously when the defending soldiers decided that instead of feeding these people, they would just go ahead and eat them. Further on this subject, Christian Zhazga, I hope I'm saying that right, asks me to please do more of the absolute insanity that is Chinese medieval history, to which my reply is, I will, but bear with me because it's not my area of expertise, so the research takes me ages. Okay, Lanka then goes on to ask, which is quite topical, where do you get your video ideas and research from? So, here there is no real set rule. I honestly just look out for whatever catches my ear and then dive more into the research there. What I'm really looking for are lesser known stories or something really gruesome that I can use to hook you guys in, and then once I've got your attention with the savage stuff, I can slip in some actual history. For research, honestly, if it's a brand new topic, I start with Wikipedia. If my research stopped at Wikipedia, you could call me lazy, but I think it's perfectly fine to start with Wikipedia. It's a great tool for new topics because everything is broken down extremely clearly, and you can walk away with a decent bit of context in less than half an hour and then go on to do your further reading. Sometimes they'll even have books or academic works that are cited, and then I can go to read those to deepen my understanding. Back on Wikipedia, though, just to get an idea, I was recently looking into doing a video on impalement, so I was reading through that article to sort of get an idea of where to start. I knew I was going to do something on Vlad, Dracula, the Impaler, but I wanted to know more about impalement. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So this is where I came across my inspiration for the latest video, the hooks. Now, look here on Wikipedia, it's literally 300 or so words. So I still needed to do a lot more research to actually make that a video, but my introduction to the subject came from a quick glance at Wikipedia. So I think personally Wikipedia's fine, as long as that's not the beginning and the end of your research. Okay, obviously, books. I especially like listening to audiobooks while I go about my day, and they're a great way to come across new ideas or dive deeper into a chosen topic. If you're interested in some book recommendations, let me know. Right now, I'm reading The Origins of Political Order by Francis Fukuyama, which is more on the sort of politics, political theory side of things and history, but it's still an awesome read, especially if you're interested in how governments formed, how we moved from hunter-gatherers, simple societies, into really complicated societies led by a government with institutions and so on. And then lastly, the historical sources themselves, right? They can be a pain to read, especially the further back you go once you start to get into Old English, but they are immensely insightful. Okay, Blue Mouse has a question about medieval surgery. They ask, did they have any kind of painkillers while surgeons operated on wounds? Yes, they did. A lot of people think that alcohol was used as a painkiller in these days, and that's not completely correct. Alcohol is a great painkiller for things like toothaches or other irritations, or failing marriage, emotional pain, but if you're operating on an open wound, the last thing you want is a drunk patient, because A, drunk people can't sit still, and B, alcohol thins the blood, which means a lot more bleeding. This, by the way, is the reason that a lot of tattoo artists refuse to tattoo drunk people. It's not the ethical dilemma of, oh, they're too drunk to make the right choice. It's literally just, it's much more hassle than it's worth. Okay, so if you can't use booze, what can you use? Well, in the case of Hal, who got an arrow to the face, the anaesthetic to fix that injury was a mixture of henbane, hemlock, and opium. So yes, there was definitely something to numb the pain there. I'm not sure if it was probably more effective than modern anaesthetic. I wouldn't know. But I reckon with that combination, you'd be getting some good shut-eye. So yes, general anaesthetic, not localized though. Okay. Pete Hay asks 4 questions. So we're going to rapid fire these. Okay, question 1. What are you doing besides YouTube? Not much anymore. I used to run a business where I would be a spokesperson for other businesses, and I still do some of that work just to cover the bills. You know, advertisements, walkthroughs, tutorials for inside companies. You know, you see those videos where someone will show you what they expect from what they expect you to do while you're at the company, and the processes and so on. I did educational stuff like that. Okay, right now I'm doing my best to just plug away on YouTube, and I also present for some other channels too. But yeah, I do have that other side business, but again, I'm trying to do less and less and less and less of that and more of this. Okay, question 2. What is your connection to history? I used to be a history teacher. Okay, question 3. Do you do work for this channel alone? Yes, 90% of the time. My lovely partner Magda, will jump in and help out with the editing if I get swamped, but generally it's just me, myself, and I. Okay. Lastly, of this gentleman's questions, what are the different steps in the process? Okay, so there are 8 steps to every video I make. First, you have to come up with an idea, then you have to research it, write it, proofread it, make a thumbnail, record the video itself, then edit it, then upload it, and watch the analytics to see what is and isn't working. There's also editing includes another couple of steps, because I've got to find the images, make them, put them together, blah, 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 blah. It's a lot of work, but it's a labor of love, and I am very grateful I can do it. Okay, next question is about the video on the assassination of Julius Caesar, in which in the title, I call Caesar a tyrant. And 2-3 asks, was he really a tyrant? Yes, Julius Caesar was a tyrant. He made himself dictator for life, and he systematically moved power away from the Roman political institutions and into his own hands. He banished or killed his political opponents even after the civil war was over. This guy was definitely a tyrant. He may not have been as tyrannical as, say, Sulla before him, or Octavian, Augustus Caesar after him, but I don't think that you can argue that he was tyrannical, right? I love Caesar, and I think He's one of the most fascinating, complicated, sometimes naughty figures in all of history. I think his life and death were interesting and exciting and tragic. And I think you can make the argument that he was justified in taking all of this power into his own hands because Rome had a lot of big problems that it was struggling to fix given the political gridlock that led up to the Civil War. But even if his tyranny was justified, again, that's a whole other argument there, but even if it was, I'm not saying it is, even if it was justified, that doesn't actually change the definition of tyranny. Julius Caesar was most definitely a tyrant, and if it wasn't for him, Rome could have very, very well remained a republic up until the end. However, because of the political fragility that was left in the wake of Caesar's absolute mauling of Rome's political institutions, it was very, very easy, perhaps inevitable, for someone, who happened to be his nephew, to go on and turn Rome from a republic into an empire ruled by one man. That's definitely tyranny. Okay, last question. This one's from Lewis Harold, who asks, will you be doing a video following the story onto the Roman Empire? Yes, I will, but not yet. Roman history is what got me into history in the first place, and I want to do a series that takes you all the way from when Caesar was a boy, up to his victory, his death, the rise of his nephew Octavian, and then the emperors of Rome until its eventual collapse. However, Roman history is very, very well covered on YouTube, and as a small channel, I need to be focusing on some of the lesser known topics or stories to try and get people engaged and ready for more. So yes, I will be doing it, but first I need to kind of get a bit more established so that people will actually click on it and watch and have trust that this channel will be a quality watch that's worth their time. Okay, that's all we have time for today. I need to get back to doing some I need to go back and do some research for the upcoming videos. As always, a massive thank you for watching, especially if you got this far. For those who remember the last Q&A, yes, my dad is coming back. We'll host another one in May when he's visiting me here again in Spain. If you've got a question for that, it goes right down there. If you fancy joining me on Patreon, there's a link in the description also. Cheers.